Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling something I find absolutely fascinating, the evolution of the internal auditor. We're looking at how this role transitions from being a traditional compliance detective, someone who primarily looks at the past, into a forward-looking, highly trusted business advisor.
So how exactly does an auditor make that leap? Well, it really all comes down to advisory or consulting services. This is the specialized capability that unlocks just immense proactive value for an organization. Because when you step into this role, you aren't just checking boxes anymore. You're actively enhancing decision-making and helping your organization navigate some pretty complex future challenges.
Here's our mental map for today's explainer. We're going to run through an overview of these services, outline the internal auditor's specific responsibilities, dive into benchmarking, and wrap up with a look at some other key advisory services.
All right, kicking things off with Section 4.1, Overview.
To really wrap our heads around advisory services, we have to put them side by side with traditional assurance. Think about it. In a typical assurance engagement, you're providing a formal evaluation, right? And you, the auditor, are the one dictating the scope of the work. Advisory services are a totally different ballgame. These are specialized consultations. You're offering guidance to improve operations, not providing formal assurance. And honestly, the best part? The scope of the work is actually hammered out together with the people you're assisting. It's highly collaborative.
And because this advisory umbrella is so massive, the actual work can take on a ton of different forms. I mean, one day you might be in a formal engagement with a rigid written agreement, and the very next week you're sitting on a special merger team or scrambling to help with emergency disaster recovery. You might even find yourself running educational engagements to train staff on risk, or facilitative engagements to help management assess their own internal issues. The versatility here is just incredible.
But there is a hard, absolute boundary you can never, ever cross. The golden rule of advisory services is this: you cannot run the business. While you're there to provide top-tier insight and foresight, management and management alone makes the ultimate decisions to adopt or implement any of your recommendations.
Moving right along to Section 4.2, Internal Auditor Responsibilities. Let's look at the strict rules of engagement here.
Because really, how do you provide all this great guidance without compromising your professional integrity? Well, auditors have to adhere to some key practices to protect their ultimate superpower, their objectivity. First off, before you even engage in advisory services, the Chief Audit Executive has to make sure the Board of Directors fully understands and formally approves them. Second, that empowerment has to be officially documented by amending the Internal Audit Charter. Third, and this is huge, you have to aggressively avoid conflicts of interest. For example, say the Chief Audit Executive temporarily steps in to run a business unit. Well, they obviously can't just audit themselves later. An independent third party would have to be brought in to provide assurance on those specific areas. The really critical metric you need to burn into your memory here is the 1-year cooling-off period. To maintain true independence, you absolutely cannot provide formal assurance on a function for 1 full year immediately following an advisory engagement on that same function. Basically, you can't grade your own homework, at least not until a whole year has passed.
And look, just because you're acting as an advisor doesn't mean it's suddenly a free-for-all. You still have to exercise what we call due professional care. You do this through 3 methodical phases. First, you plan, meaning you determine the objectives and scope by understanding the environment. Second, you perform. You get in there, collect, and evaluate the information. And third, you communicate. This means validating your proposed advice with management before distributing any final deliverables.
Now, as we touched on a minute ago, the objectives and scope for this kind of work are a joint effort with management. But, and this is a massive caveat, if you're doing your advisory work and you suddenly stumble upon substantial risk exposures or material control weaknesses, you can't just ignore them because they weren't in the agreed-upon scope. Remember, you are still primarily an internal auditor. You have a strict obligation to report those substantial risks to management and potentially right up to the board. Your primary loyalty always goes to the safety of the organization.
Okay, let's turn to Section 4.3, Benchmarking.
Let's crack open the advisor's toolkit, because benchmarking is easily one of the most powerful frameworks you have for performance improvement. By acting as a facilitator for a benchmarking framework, you're essentially helping the organization measure itself against top performers. And you don't do this using vague feelings or gut instincts. You use hard data and specific metrics. We're talking about things like comparing financial ratios, tracking the exact number of days it takes to close a financial system, looking at customer satisfaction percentages, or even measuring product defects per million.
Actually, pulling this off is a pretty complex process. It requires 5 distinct phases. You start by selecting and prioritizing critical projects. Then you organize cross-functional teams who really understand the internal processes. But I want you to notice phase 3, researching best-in-class performance. This is almost always the most difficult part of the entire journey. Why? Because finding top-tier competitors who are actually willing to share their secret sauce is incredibly tough. You have to carefully select your benchmarking partners and gather solid information before you can even move on to analyzing the data and implementing those leadership-driven changes.
And you can apply these benchmarks in a few distinct ways depending on what you're trying to achieve. For instance, internal benchmarking might just compare different retail stores within your own chain to find weak spots. External or competitive benchmarking pits you directly against industry rivals. You can also benchmark specific processes, like how fast your R&D department works, or even look at broad strategic business models. It's an amazingly adaptable tool.
Which brings us to our final section, 4.4, Other Advisory Services.
So, beyond benchmarking, where else does your specialized knowledge add huge value? Well, imagine your company is about to acquire a competitor. It probably sounds amazing on paper, right? But are the IT systems actually compatible? Are the company cultures going to violently clash the second the deal closes? That's exactly where due diligence auditing comes in. As an advisor, you verify if the expected benefits and operating synergies are grounded in reality. You review the whole shebang, from operations and IT internal controls to finance, compliance, and integration planning, just to ensure the deal actually makes sense.
Another area is business process mapping. When you're in the weeds visualizing workflows, you're generally going to run into 2 totally different philosophies. Think of it like a house. Total quality management, or TQM, is all about continuous incremental improvement. It's like constantly upgrading the rooms, painting the walls, replacing the floors. But re-engineering? That is radical process innovation. It's tearing the house down to the studs to build something completely new, eliminating unnecessary tasks entirely. And both of these methods heavily impact internal controls, often shifting the organization toward highly automated self-correcting systems.
And finally, we've got system development reviews. We all know organizations spend absolutely massive amounts of money building or buying new software. By getting involved early in the system's development lifecycle, internal auditors can ensure that vital internal controls and audit trails are baked in from day one. That saves the company from making incredibly expensive, painful modifications later on. You're basically acting as the guardrail, making sure user needs are recorded and met, components are rigorously tested, and the whole development stays perfectly on track. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. If traditional audits are all about looking backward, how will you use advisory services to shape what happens next? By mastering these frameworks, protecting your objectivity, and leveraging tools like benchmarking, you completely change your value proposition. You're no longer just a historian of past compliance. You literally become a trusted architect of your organization's future success. So take these concepts and start shaping what happens next.